Whenever a new PC product launches, it's inevitable that we, the public at large, will have to suffer through a rash of cringy new naming conventions that vendors use to try to differentiate their release from the rest. Whether it's overly long verbiage that doesn't even explain what the product is, like the Asus ROG Rampage 6 Extreme Omega, or companies adding Pro to every single SKU, or a completely nonsensical jumble of letters and numbers like the LG 38GL950G-B, or like XFX empowering their latest graphics cards with the powers of meme culture. They're all bad. But just because the names are terrible doesn't mean the products are. And to be honest, even if you remember the name of the XFX 5600 XT THICC simply because you hate it, well, then the marketing department has done its job. XFX sent over their latest THICC branded products, two 5600 XTs, and today we will take a deep dive into both of them. So before we get into this, guys, I just wanted to let you know that when I scripted this and recorded this earlier today, afterwards I got in contact with XFX about a few issues that I encountered, and they did give me some updates and some information as to why things might have been happening the way I saw them. So if you want some clarification on that stuff, make sure you stick around to the end of the video. I will be letting you guys know what they said. Now, I'm sure you guys are already familiar with AMD's latest graphics card, the Radeon RX 5600 XT. It's based on the same Navi die that we got in the 5700 and even performs close to that level in a lot of applications. That's all thanks to a refreshed V-BIOS that was pushed out right before launch and was likely done in an effort to make the cards more appealing compared to a reduced price version of the RTX 2060. But regardless of why it happened, the fact is that most 5600 XTs on the market by this time either are shipping with the new V-BIOS or can relatively easily be flashed by the end user to achieve a significantly higher level of performance than, I guess we'll call it stock. With these two 5600 XTs I have here on the table, they shipped from XFX pre-flashed, but they wanted me to let you know that the new BIOS is available on their website if you ordered one of the first batch off the assembly line, and I will link it down below. So why are there two of these then? When the 5700 XT launched and XFX introduced the THICC, it was met with a whole lot of Sure, it looked cool, but for something that was this big and bulky and sported such a giant cooler, thermal performance was merely okay, and the card didn't give us anything special versus other premium AIB models. In order to fix this, XFX came out with this, the THICC, the 3-fan version of the card that promised to remedy those issues, and indeed, it did, with a reconfigured cold plate design and lower temps all around. Because the THICC and the THICC branding was now established, I assume XFX wanted to continue on with the same naming scheme for future releases. So now we have both a 2-fan and a 3-fan version of the 5600 XT. What makes these two different, however, isn't just the number of fans. One of the issues with the 5700 XT THICC was that the plastic shroud was huge and the fans just didn't cover enough of it. The THICC used basically these same dimensions, but covered more of the surface area with fans. For the 5600 XT, the THICC is actually significantly smaller than the THICC, meaning that percentage-wise, the surface area is still adequately ventilated. The THICC has two 100mm fans, while the THICC uses one 100mm fan in the middle, flanked by two 90mm fans. Other differences are in overall length and power requirements. Per my measurements, the THICC is a full 43mm longer while being the same width, meaning that fitment might be an issue in smaller cases that don't have a good amount of GPU clearance. That's not to say though that the only differences these two have is the cooler, as they actually use completely different PCB designs. The THICC only needs a single 8-pin PCIe connection, which is the same as the AMD reference design spec, while the THICC needs an 8-pin plus a 6-pin. I'm actually a little confused by this because in testing, the THICC consistently pulled more wattage, but both were still under the 150 watt rated TDP from AMD, meaning that the extra power plug isn't really necessary and didn't do a whole lot. Perhaps it would be useful for overclocking, but we won't be getting into that today. Now, when compared to the original THICC 5700 XT, neither the 5600 XT THICC2 or THICC3 versions actually justified their name. They're both actually just 2-slot cards, which I love. And I assume that the name refers more to the style of the shroud design than to the actual physical thickness of the cooler, which I guess is fine for continuity's sake. The fan blades are also different from the Big Daddy version, but they're identical between these two right here. Both cards come with really nice metal black on black vented backplates and use a quad heat pipe design. I tested these cards against the Sapphire Pulse that AMD sent over for initial launch testing. And usually in scenarios like this, I don't expect to see a huge performance difference. What I'd usually be testing for here is noise, thermals, and power, with maybe an eye on some small frame rate differences here and there. Well, let me tell you that I was quite shocked to see that both the THICC2 and the THICC3 performed measurably worse than the Sapphire Pulse in my 9900K test bed. I was so surprised, in fact, that despite having just verified the Pulse's numbers yesterday, I went back and retested it, confirming that my results were correct. The difference came down entirely to memory speed. Here are the 3 cards looping Unigine Heaven, and the Pulse version clocks the memory way up to 3500 MHz, giving it a huge advantage in almost all of the tested titles. This is despite the fact that the cards averaged almost the exact same clock speed after my standard half-hour soak. With the clock speeds the same, the higher memory clocks on the Pulse made all the difference. Temperature-wise, the Pulse was also the most effective cooler, with an average load temp of 65°C versus 71 and 73°C for the XFX cards. Acoustic performance was pretty much a wash. I was actually quite impressed with all of these cards, as the noise floor in my office is about 40 decibels, and even after a half hour of stress, I could barely hear all the fans. Here are the results of the benchmarks. The XFX 5600 XT THICC2 sells for $300, while the THICC3 sells for about $20 more. Given the gaming results here, if you had to choose between these two cards, I think the THICC2 is probably the easy winner. It's smaller, it runs slightly cooler, and gaming performance is almost identical. I still don't quite know why it's drawing more power, but I'll reach out to XFX about that. They both ran fairly quiet and put up some really strong 1080p numbers, and would likely also allow you to game at 1440p. However, there's one problem here. The Sapphire Pulse is just better at everything. It's $290, so $10 cheaper than the THICC2. It clocks the same, runs the memory faster, consumes less power than the THICC2, is a better thermal performer, and games even better. So while the XFX THICC family of 5600 XTs is in a vacuum pretty good, it's hard to recommend them over a better, cheaper variant in the Sapphire Pulse. That is, unless you really want to unironically use the word thick in a sentence when referencing your PC's performance. Just to circle back to that power issue that we were seeing with the disparity with the THICC2 drawing a lot more power than the THICC3, I did reach out to XFX, and what they told me was it was likely because the THICC2 was just pulling so much more voltage, and the reason for that usually is because of silicon quality. Now, obviously there's going to be variance in silicon quality between cards. It's also kind of nice and shows that they weren't cherry picking these for reviewers, so that's kind of cool. But that means that you could also see something similar if you do get a bum chip in your 5600 XT. I don't think it really affected performance very much, but as you can see, it did cause the card to pull more power. So that is definitely something that you could potentially experience as well. Now, as far as memory speed goes, the reason that the Pulse was outperforming the XFX cards purely comes down to memory speed. Pulse running 14 gigabits per second memory. The Sapphire version's only still running 12 gigabits per second memory. XFX is working on a new VBIOS that increases the memory speed. However, that's happening in China. That's where all their engineering goes on. And it's Chinese New Year right now, so everything is kind of shut down for a couple weeks, kind of put a kink in the plans, but they are working on it. Hopefully you're gonna have it out soon. And if that's the case, then you're probably gonna see very similar performance across all of these cards. And it kind of just comes down to form factor, acoustics and thermals. Acoustics very similar again across the board, but form factor very different between these three cards. And then thermals, the Pulse is still probably gonna perform a little bit better there. So that's what XFX told me. They are working on the VBIOS for faster memory, and also the difference here is probably coming down to like ASIC quality of the GPUs themselves. Interesting that they sent me two cards with such different quality chips, but that's how it happens sometimes. So I appreciate their honesty and getting back to me about that. And thanks guys for watching. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Make sure to check out bpscustoms.com for cool merch like this, and get subscribed if you are not already. As always, guys, I'll see you next time.